I'm the crazy Mafia's new secret husband. Bang! The sound shattered everything around me. I didn't even have time to react before Alessandro jumped in front of me. 1 second he was in his car and the next he was there, shielding me. My ears were still ringing from the gunshot, and it took a second for me to realize what had just happened. Alessandro, he took a bullet for me. I just stood there frozen. My brain couldn't keep up with what my eyes were seeing. This was the same man who told me 2 days ago that I was just his trophy husband, that I meant nothing to him. He'd made it clear that this marriage was nothing but a business deal to him. So why? Why would he save me? He collapsed on me, gasping for air, blood already staining his shirt. I wanted to move, to help him, hold him, but my hands wouldn't move. I was just numb, stuck between disbelief and fear. Why would he do this? I thought he hated me. But now he's here, bleeding because of me, for me. Nothing made sense anymore, and the worst part, I was terrified to find out why. Flashback. 7 months ago, I sat at the far end of the dining table, staring at the chipped edge of my plate while my stepsister, Claudia, whined to my father for the 100th time. She was pacing back and forth, her voice rising with every complaint. I won't do it, father. I won't marry that monster, she snapped, arms crossed over her chest, glaring at him. He discards his wives like old shoes. First one, then another, and another. I'm not going to be his next victim. She wasn't wrong. Alessandro's reputation was infamous. 3 ex-wives, all with horror stories about his cruelty. The rumors were endless, but the Mafia had a way of making sure no one could prove anything. My father looked tense, his jaw clenched, but Claudia wasn't finished. Maybe, she said with a nasty smirk, he's not interested in women at all. Maybe you should just give him Romeo. He might be more to his taste. My blood ran cold. I felt her eyes on me, and I didn't dare look up. This wasn't the first time she made snide comments like that. Ever since Alessandro came into the picture as a potential solution to our family's debt, Claudia had been dragging me into her arguments, throwing out any excuse to get herself off the hook. My stepmother, of course, chimed in, always ready to back up her daughter. Claudia is right, she said, her voice sickly sweet. Why should she be forced into a marriage with someone like him? Let's be honest, we all know what kind of man Alessandro is. Perhaps Romeo would suit him better. She laughed like it was a joke, but I knew how much venom there was underneath. I wanted to shrink into the chair, to disappear. My father's face turned red with anger, veins pulsing in his neck. He slammed his fist on the table, making us all jump. Enough, he roared, standing up. Do you think we have a choice? We owe more money than I can count. If I could, I'd sell all 3 of you to that man just to get him to help us. Claudia gasped, offended, while my stepmother looked shocked, but neither of them said anything after that. The tension was thick in the air, suffocating. I swallowed hard, wishing I could just vanish. Just then the doorbell rang. The house went silent. We all knew who it was. My father cleared his throat, adjusted his tie nervously, and nodded for me to answer the door. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky, and walked to the entrance. When I opened the door, Alessandro stood there, surrounded by 2 of his men. He was intimidating in person, as his reputation suggested. Tall, with sharp green eyes that felt like they could cut through you. His pitch-black hair was slicked back, and the scar over his right eyebrow only made him more intimidating. Mr. Moretti, Alessandro said smoothly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His men followed, standing silently by the door. Thank you for inviting me to discuss our arrangement. My father suddenly, all smiles and politeness, nodded and gestured for him to sit. Of course, Mr. Russo. Please, let's discuss the terms. They sat at the table and I quietly slipped back into my seat. Keeping my head down, I felt Alessandro's eyes on me, but I didn't dare look up. The deal is simple, my father said, trying to sound confident. You help us clear the debt, and we offer Claudia's hand in marriage as a sign of gratitude. Alessandro's gaze flicked to Claudia, who was staring at him with a mix of fear and disdain. He said nothing for a long moment, letting the silence hang in the air. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. I never said I would marry your daughter, he said, eyes cold as ice. My father froze, confusion crossing his face. I don't understand, he stammered. You're not interested in Claudia? Alessandro's eyes drifted across the table, finally landing on me. His stare was intense, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly, he stood up and pointed directly at me. I want him, he said simply. I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. The room went dead silent. My father looked like he'd been slapped in the face. Him? He repeated, dumbfounded. Alessandro didn't bother explaining further. My lawyer will handle the registration, he said, straightening his suit jacket. My driver will come to pick you up in 2 days. Until then, you'll take care of the paperwork. I couldn't breathe. Was this really happening? He turned to leave, his men following him out the door without another word. The front door clicked shut behind them as I sat there numb, staring at the space where Alessandro had just been. My father looked furious, Claudia looked like she might scream, and my stepmother, she just smiled. 2 days later. The car ride was a blur. One moment I was getting picked up by Alessandro's driver, and the next we were pulling up to the largest mansion I'd ever seen. It looked like something from a Gothic movie, tall, intimidating, and surrounded by iron gates. Inside, it was even more overwhelming. The entrance hall was decked out in black and gold, with the portraits of some serious-looking man on the walls. Huge iron armor stood in the corners, and giant rifles were displayed like trophies. It felt cold and unsettling. The butler surprisingly kind and vibrant, so in contrast to the place led me to my room. I was relieved to find it was nothing like the rest of the mansion. The walls were soft beige with baby blue accents, and a large window overlooked a beautiful garden. It felt peaceful. After he left, I collapsed onto the bed, sinking into the soft blankets. A strange feeling washed over me. I was free from my stepmother and Claudia's torment, but the questions remained: why had Alessandro chosen me? Was he really as cruel as everyone said? And most importantly, what came next? 3 months later. I had been living here for months, comfortably, I would say. I rarely saw Alessandro. He was mostly out, and the few times I did see him, he was unexpectedly kind. Intimidating, but kind. I was sitting in the corner of the large sitting room when I heard footsteps. My heart jumped a little. As I saw him walk in, his presence was always so commanding, and it didn't help that I still couldn't figure him out. He crossed the room casually, glancing at me with a small smirk. "You seem nervous," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was a teasing edge to it. "Are you scared of me?" I bit my lip, hesitating before I nodded slightly. There was no point in lying. His eyes flickered with amusement, and he let out a soft chuckle. "You're not happy with me as your husband?" My eyes widened, and I shook my head quickly. No, that's not what I meant at all," I fumbled, my words coming out in a rush. He stood up smoothly, and for a second, I thought I had offended him, but instead, he walked closer and handed me a bouquet of pale peach-colored roses. I hadn't noticed his hands before. "These are for you," he said, holding them out to me. "The gardeners here grafted this new kind. I thought they'd look good in your room." I stared at the roses, dumbfounded, as I took them from his hands. He didn't wait for a response. He simply nodded with a tiny, soft smile and left the room, leaving me sitting there, speechless. I looked down at the roses in my hands, the soft petals brushing my fingers. Was this the same man everyone called cruel? About a month later. Well, if I had learned anything over the months about Alessandro, it was that he was a man of great temper. I guess that was to be expected for some reason. I luckily was never the recipient of it, and I'm not sure if it was just me, but he seemed to try to control it whenever I was around. One day I was heading to the study when I heard Alessandro's voice booming through the hallway. My footsteps slowed, my heart pounding in my chest. He was shouting again, furious at someone, and though I couldn't make out the words, the anger in his tone was unmistakable. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked through the doorway inside. Alessandro was standing with a group of his men, all of whom looked terrified. He was pacing back and forth, his voice sharp and cutting as he barked orders. His green eyes blazed with fury, and it was clear someone had messed up badly. I must have made a sound because suddenly Alessandro's gaze snapped to me. For a second I froze, not sure if I should run or stay. His expression softened just a fraction when he saw me, and with a deep breath he stopped shouting. "Enough," he said, his voice suddenly calmer, but still carrying authority. "Fix it, now." The men nodded hurriedly, scrambling to leave the room. Once they were gone, Alessandro turned to me, his face no longer angry, but his voice still firm. "Did you need something?" he asked, as if the previous storm hadn't even happened. I swallowed nervously, trying to push away the image of him yelling. My father called earlier," I said quietly. "He invited us both to dinner. I was wondering if you were free." Alessandro looked at me for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I might not be able to make it," he said after a pause. "I have a few things to handle here, but I'll ask the driver to take you." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. "Okay," I mumbled, quickly excusing myself. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more to Alessandro than anyone ever saw. The next day. Dinner was already uncomfortable like it always had been. Claudia was in her usual form, taking jabs at me every chance she got. I tried to ignore her, but she wasn't making it easy. "So, Romeo," she sneered, swirling her wine, How's it feel being the Mafia King's little secret husband? Must be nice living in that big house doing absolutely nothing. You're basically a kept pet, aren't you? I clenched my jaw, staring at my plate, trying not to let her words get to me. But the smug tone in her voice was hard to tune out. Don't tease him, dear, my stepmother added with a fake smile. Romeo's probably just enjoying his little vacation from real life. Isn't that right, sweetheart? You've got nothing to worry about now. I stayed quiet. There was no point in arguing. My father, as usual, just sat there, not saying anything, pretending like he wasn't hearing all of this. Typical. Say something, Claudia taunted, leaning closer. Or is it because you know this whole marriage is a joke? Alessandro doesn't even want anyone to know about you. I mean, he's clearly embarrassed by you. That's why you're still a secret, right? Her words hit hard, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I was about to excuse myself when the door opened and in walked Alessandro. The entire room went silent. He didn't say anything at first, just glanced around the table, his expression calm but with that cold edge I'd come to recognize. He locked eyes with my father, who suddenly looked nervous. Interesting dinner conversation, Alessandro said coolly. Seems you're all very comfortable mocking my husband. Claudia, never knowing when to shut up, jumped in. What husband? She spat. It's not like you care for him. He's an embarrassment to you, hence the secret. My father's face turned white and he snapped at her. Claudia, enough! His voice was harsher than I'd ever heard. Apologize to Mr. Russo right now. Before she could respond, Alessandro turned to me, his gaze softening. Get up, he said gently but firmly. I stood without question, feeling his hand rest on my shoulder as he led me toward the door. Alessandro paused and looked back at Claudia, his expression unyielding. You owe my husband an apology, he said, his voice low but steady. You will apologize for your disrespect, right now. Claudia opened her mouth to protest, but Alessandro shot her a look that silenced her. I won't ask again, he warned. Reluctantly, she rolled her eyes and said, Fine, I'm sorry, Romeo, whatever. It was hardly sincere, but it was enough. Now, that wasn't so hard, was it? Alessandro said, his tone still cool. He turned to my father next, his voice calm but icy. I hope that daughter of yours will be disciplined as I expect of you. My father nodded quickly, looking like he wanted to sink into the floor. Yes, of course, he stammered. Without another word, Alessandro guided me out of the house, his arm still around me. I felt strangely relieved. Maybe I didn't understand everything, but in that moment, I knew he had my back. As we stepped outside, the cool evening air washed over me. I glanced up at Alessandro, who looked down at me with a soft expression. Let's get you out of here, he said, leading me away from the tension of my family and toward the car waiting for us. I couldn't help but smile. In that moment, I felt safe and protected, and I knew I could trust him. A month later. A month had passed, and in all that time, I'd barely seen Alessandro. He was always busy. Meetings, business, whatever it was that kept him out of the house. Our interactions were brief, a few words exchanged here and there, but nothing more. Still, I couldn't deny he was kind to me. More kind than anyone had been since my mom died. I guess it was my mom's undoing of me when she named me Romeo. I always expected huge romance out of my life, but soon learned not to expect much. So even though it wasn't the marriage I had imagined, not by a long shot, it wasn't bad either. Life with him was quiet, peaceful in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't constantly on edge like I was with my stepmother and Claudia. Here, I felt safe. I sometimes wondered why he married me. The question nagged at the back of my mind, especially after what Claudia said. That he was embarrassed of me, that's why I was his secret husband. It wasn't like I could dismiss it entirely. It did make some sense, but then I remembered how he stood up for me at the dinner, how he protected me, and it made me doubt those words. He never treated me cruelly. In fact, he'd been nothing but considerate, and that was enough for me. Maybe I didn't need to understand everything. Maybe I didn't need to question it all. There was this warm feeling that came over me whenever I thought about him. I couldn't quite place it, but it was nice. Even if our marriage wasn't what people would call typical, it was becoming something that felt good in its own way. 2 months later. I had been quietly falling for Alessandro over the past few weeks. He was distant, sure, but there was this warmth about him that made me feel safe, and the more I thought about him, the more this strange feeling in my chest grew. So when I found out it was his birthday, I decided to do something special, even if he wasn't big on celebrations. I spent the whole afternoon secretly preparing a cake. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple vanilla one, but I made it with care. By evening, I gathered my courage, took a deep breath, and carried the cake to his room. I knocked softly, and when Alessandro opened the door, he looked a little off. There was something tense in his eyes, but I tried to brush it off. I wanted to give you something, I said, feeling a little nervous but also excited. He frowned slightly but stepped aside to let me in. What is it? He asked, his voice low and serious. I set the cake down on the small table by the window and smiled up at him. Happy birthday, I said softly, lighting the candles. I made this for you. I know it's not much, but I wanted to do something special. For a moment, Alessandro just stared at me. Then his expression darkened, and to my surprise, he snapped. What do you think you're doing? I blinked, completely thrown off by his tone. I just wanted to wish you a happy birthday, I said, quietly confused. I thought you might like the cake. He glared at me, his jaw tight. Who asked you to do this? No one, I stammered, my heart sinking. I'm your husband. I don't need anyone to tell me to do these things. His eyes narrowed, and his voice was cold as ice. Husband? He scoffed. You're nothing more than a trophy husband, Romeo. You think this is some real marriage? I paid for you. Handsomely. Don't forget that. Don't expect anything else from me. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My heart pounded in my chest as his words cut deeper than I could have imagined. My hands trembled as I stared at him, the cake sitting on the table between us like some cruel joke. I didn't mean to, my voice cracked, and I couldn't finish the sentence. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I fought to keep them from falling. Without another word, I turned and bolted out of the room, leaving everything behind. As I ran down the hallway, the tears finally spilled over. I couldn't believe how wrong I'd been. This whole time I thought maybe, just maybe, there was something between us, but Alessandro's words shattered that hope, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. The next day. The next morning, I woke up with the heaviness in my chest. Alessandro's words from last night echoed in my head like a broken record. Trophy husband. Paid for. It hurt more than I could describe, and I realized I couldn't stay here anymore. There was no point. He didn't want me. I was just some deal he made. I packed my stuff quickly, throwing clothes into a suitcase, not caring about anything else. I just needed to leave, to get away from this place, from him. I didn't even tell anyone I was going. I just walked straight out, got into the car, and told the driver to take me away. We had barely made it halfway down the road when out of nowhere a line of cars blocked our path. At least 20 of them. My heart started racing as a bunch of dangerous-looking men stepped out. One of them pointed a gun directly at me and I froze, panic shooting through me. Before I could even react, another car came speeding up from behind, cutting off the line of cars. The door hadn't even fully opened when someone leaped out of it, running straight toward me. It was Alessandro. Everything happened so fast. He didn't hesitate for a second. He ran in front of me, shielding me with his body, and in that split second, a gunshot rang out. The bullet hit him. My heart stopped. Alessandro! I screamed as he collapsed, his body falling right on top of me. He had saved me, and all I could do was watch him fall, my mind spinning, unable to process what just happened. Flashback ends. 3 days later. Alessandro's backup arrived the second he was shot. It was like something out of a movie. The whole street erupted in chaos as men swarmed the area, taking down the guys who had blocked my car. The sound of gunfire filled the air, but I couldn't focus on any of it. My eyes were locked on Alessandro, lying on the ground bleeding. Within minutes, he was rushed to the hospital, and I followed without a second thought. The whole ride there, I couldn't think straight. He'd taken a bullet for me. The same man who told me I was just a trophy husband had thrown himself in front of a gun for me. It's been 3 days now. I haven't left his side. The sterile smell of the hospital, the constant beeping of the machines, and the fear of losing him. It all became my world. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I just sat there, waiting for some sign that he would be okay. And finally today the doctor gave me the news I'd been hoping for. Alessandro was out of danger. Relief flooded through me, but at the same time, something else weighed on my heart. Now that he was safe, I didn't know what to do next. Maybe I wasn't needed anymore. The truth was, as much as I cared for him, this wasn't a real marriage. He didn't love me, and I couldn't keep pretending. I'd been fooling myself into thinking we had something more, but the reality was clear. There was no love here, just duty. I made up my mind I couldn't stay. I didn't want to live like this, feeling like I was nothing more than a decoration in his life, so I quietly started heading for the door. As I reached the hospital's exit, the butler caught up to me. "Where are you going, sir?" he asked, his face calm but concerned. I sighed, my heart heavy. "I can't do this anymore," I admitted, my voice shaking. "Don't try to stop me, please. There's no love here. Alessandro doesn't love me. He's made it clear. I'm just Something he paid for. I don't want to live like that. The butler looked at me with a deep understanding, like he had been waiting for this conversation. You're wrong, sir. He cares for you more than you realize. I frowned, confused. What are you talking about? He doesn't even let me in. He's cold, distant. How could he care about me? The butler sighed, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes. Alessandro has a past that haunts him. His childhood wasn't easy. He lost his parents when he was only but a teenager. That too on his birthday, and it left a deep scar. He's had to protect himself ever since, and being in his position, well, having enemies comes with the territory. He can't afford to trust anyone. I listened, stunned. I never knew any of this. But it's not just that, the butler continued. His ex-wives, I know the rumors, sir, but the truth was far from it. They all faked their love for him. Each one of them had their own motives, money, power, status. They never cared about him, not really. It's left him too scared to let anyone in, to open himself up again. I swallowed hard, the pieces starting to come together in my mind. He's closed off because he's terrified of being hurt again, the butler said softly. But you're different. He's cared about you for a long time, even before you knew him. I don't know all the details, but I do know this. His enemies learned that you meant something to him. That's why he married you, to protect you. Not just because of some deal, but because he didn't want you to get hurt. I stood there speechless. All this time I'd been wrong about him. Alessandro wasn't embarrassed by me. He wasn't cold because he didn't care. He was scared. Please, the butler added, his voice gentle. Don't give up on him yet. I felt the weight of his words sink in, my heart pulling me in a million different directions. Maybe there was more to Alessandro than I realized, and maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. A week later. It had been a week since the incident, and I hadn't left Alessandro's side. The days blurred together, a mix of worry and exhaustion, but I stayed, keeping vigil by his bed. Every small movement, every little twitch made my heart leap with the hope that he'd wake up soon. And finally, one morning, he stirred. His fingers twitched, then his eyelids fluttered open. My heart raced as I leaned closer, hardly believing he was waking up. Alessandro, I whispered, my voice shaky with relief. He blinked a few times, his gaze focusing on me. Romeo. His voice was hoarse, confused. What are you doing here? I smiled, feeling an overwhelming sense of happiness wash over me. You're awake, I said softly, tears welling up in my eyes. He looked around the room, realizing what had happened, and then turned back to me, his expression softening. You stayed all this time? I nodded, still fighting back tears. Of course I did. Alessandro's face shifted into something I hadn't seen before. Vulnerability. I'm sorry about that day, he began, but I cut him off. No, I said quickly, shaking my head. I'm the one who should be apologizing. I didn't know about your parents, about everything you've been through. He looked confused for a moment, then frowned. How do you know about that? It doesn't matter how I know, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I just know. I know everything now, Alessandro. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep it all to yourself? My voice cracked, and before I knew it, the tears were flowing freely down my cheeks. Alessandro chuckled softly, reaching out to wipe away my tears with his thumb. You silly man, he said, his voice low and tender. You were already going through so much. Your family pawned you off like spoiled goods, and you ended up married to the cruel Mafia boss everyone's afraid of. He shook his head. I didn't want you to worry any more than you already were. Besides, it was nothing I couldn't handle. I couldn't stop the tears. They just kept coming, the weight of everything we'd been through overwhelming me. Shh, Alessandro murmured, his hand gently cupping my cheek. He tried to calm me down, but it wasn't working. I was too emotional, too raw. Then, without warning, his hand moved behind my head, and he pulled me closer. His lips pressed against mine, soft yet firm, and all the confusion and hurt seemed to melt away in that moment. The cold metal of his lip-piercing brushed against my skin, a sensation that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't pull away. Instead, I kissed him back, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something about the way he kissed me, something I hadn't felt before. I could feel his emotions, his longing, his need. He had been craving me just as much as I had been craving him. Our kisses deepened, becoming more urgent, more intense. I couldn't help but feel everything I'd been denying, how much I wanted him, how much I needed him. In that moment, it wasn't just about passion. It was about connection. It was about understanding, about finally breaking down the walls between us. 3 months later. It had been 3 months since that day in the hospital, and things between Alessandro and I changed for the better. Slowly but surely, we were growing closer. There were still moments where the past haunted us, but for the most part, we were finding our way to each other. One afternoon, Alessandro surprised me by taking me to an orphanage. I looked around, confused as to why we were here. The building was so old, but well maintained, with children playing happily in the yard. I turned to Alessandro, raising an eyebrow. "Why did you bring me here?" He smiled softly, leading me closer to the entrance. "This place is important, Romeo. You may not remember it, but this is where I first saw you." I blinked in surprise. "Here? But when?" He nodded, his eyes full of warmth. "It was years ago. You were helping the kids here. I remember it clearly. Your clothes were ruined from running around with them, but you didn't care. You had this big, vibrant smile on your face. It was so innocent, so pure. I just wanted to protect it forever." I stood there speechless as he continued. "I didn't know anything about you back then, but that smile, it stayed with me. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that was the moment I fell for you." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't known he'd been carrying that with him all this time. Alessandro turned to face me, fully, his expression softening. "I've wanted to protect you ever since, Romeo. That's all I ever wanted." I felt a lump rise in my throat as he took my hands in his. His words hit me right in the heart, and before I could stop myself, tears welled up in my eyes. "I want that too," I whispered, my voice shaky. "I want to protect you just like you protected me. Let's promise to take care of each other forever. No more walls between us, no more secrets." Alessandro smiled gently, pulling me closer. "I love you, Romeo," he said softly, his voice full of sincerity. "I love you too," I replied, my heart swelling with emotion. It felt like everything had finally come full circle. Then, without hesitation, Alessandro leaned in and kissed me, and I kissed him back. The world around us seemed to disappear in that moment, and all that mattered was the two of us, standing in the place where it all began. We were no longer just two people bound by circumstance. We were partners, promising to protect and love each other now and forever. Conclusion. It wasn't long after that visit to the orphanage that Alessandro and I officially got married. The ceremony was small, just close friends, and it felt perfect. I remember a few people making rude comments about why Alessandro would marry, well, me, but before I could even process it, his men took them away, and I have no idea what happened after that. But no one dared object to our wedding again. I've completely cut ties with my family, and life feels lighter. It's still hard for Alessandro to open up fully, but we're working on it. Every day we grow a little closer, and I know we have the rest of our lives to keep building our relationship. We're in this together, forever. The end. Do you believe love can thaw even the coldest of hearts? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.